stating your name, your role in comics, company affiliation, how long you've been involved in the industry.
My name is Thompson. I am the Vice President and co-founder of Fantagraphics Books, and I've been working in comics and at Fantagraphics since 1977.
Okay, so how do you define independent comics?
Well, it's sort of it's a negative definition. Independent comics are basically the comics that are produced by publishers who are not owned by large corporations. And as a result of that, it's usually a more independent-minded type of work.
Okay. What does independent necessarily mean alternative or underground, or is it just...
Well, there's independent, there's alternative, there's underground, and they kind of intersect, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Underground, I think, as a genre, essentially is not really a useful word anymore. It very specifically referred to the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s movement of, a very specific kind of comics, which really has mutated, evolved, if you will, into what we now call alternative or independent comics. And in a sense, the alternative independent moniker is sort of strange now, since that exact same material is now being taken and repackaged by publishers like Random House. So definitions are constantly mutating.
Does the term independent have a place nowadays? After its initial run in the 80s and its kind of boom in the 90s, is there really a place for
I think it still has. I mean, you still think in terms of alternative music, for instance, in the rock world, even though a lot of the alternative artists then got picked up by people like Warner. So to a degree it reflects a style, it reflects an attitude, more so than exactly who was publishing it or releasing it at that moment.
But in that case, you just used alternative synonymously with independent.
Right, right.
Okay.
As I said, the barriers used to be very cleanly defined, and that's no longer the case.
Okay. Are these terms anything more than marketing tools?
At this point, certainly they terms are used as marketing tools. For instance, graphic novel really has become a marketing tool. It's defining, the object that we're trying to sell in such a way that most people who aren't familiar with comics understand what it is. Despite the fact that even within the world of comics, there is a big argument about whether or not graphic novel is a legitimate or useful or even non-ridiculous term. So alternative probably can be used that way, and sometimes for material that isn't necessarily really the alternative either.
Okay. Fantagraphics was one of the first independent publishers, if not the first. What could you speak a little bit about that? That you're just starting out. What drove you to that? What necessitated that?
Yeah, what drove us to become independent publishers, that's a good question, because it wasn't actually our initial intent. The thing to bear in mind is that when Fantagraphics started in the mid-1970s, we actually were publishing magazines about comics. The Nostalgia Journal, which turned into the Comics Journal, for instance. And the spreading into doing independent, or at the time they were still underground comics, really came later. It was a sort of, what the heck, we have the infrastructure set up, we can do this kind of attitude. There's also the thing to bear in mind, which is that paradoxically, when we launched the Comics Journal in the mid-1970s, which was intended to be, and turned out to be, the first and probably only serious magazine of criticism and history of comics, it was actually one of the very worst periods for comics ever. It was just dreadful. The wave of the underground has sort of crested and fallen back. The mainstream was in total doldrums, and there really wasn't a whole lot of interesting comics to talk about. So, to some degree, working at the Comics Journal for a few years, we began to realize that there weren't any good comics to talk about. And then the idea germinated in our head that maybe we should start producing some.
So you're differentiating between your being an independent publisher for the Comics Journal and becoming an independent publisher of comic books?
Right.
what was the difference there? What was that leap of change?
It wasn't it wasn't that much really of a leap. I mean, it was just publishing something slightly different. Yeah, I'm not.
Well, when you
I guess probably you could even if you want to use terms, is that originally the Comics Journal was more or less along the lines of a fanzine more than anything else. So it turned you could consider it being turning from a fanzine company into an independent comics company if you wanted to.
So did you? What was your original business model?
We still don't have one. We never had one. The original business model was, Gary was 23, I was 21. Hey, let's put out a fanzine and see if we can actually make enough money not to starve. And then it just sort of evolved from that.
Okay.
It's kind of funny to think that there have been many independent publishers, many of whom I'm sure had actual business models to start out with, and they all collapsed by the wayside. Whereas us, who never really had a business model per se, we persevered. So one can make of that what one will.
That's amazing. I'm going to pause 1 second.
If I have my head down, can I turn it back a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you can turn.
Okay. I mean, this is fine.
It's just, okay. So didn't have a business model.
Shot down all those business model follow-up questions, didn't I?
No, I didn't have any follow-up questions. That actually raised some questions, but I'm trying to dig them out of my brain. I'll come back to it. What need did you see for an independent publisher?
Well, see, the first major comic we released really was Love and Rockets, and we simply saw a need for that book to be presented to a wider audience than the little fanzine version Hernandez Brothers had produced. So it was really that simple. It was along the lines of, this is great, more people need to see this, and we have the ability to do that. So it was just really basic. It was essentially wanting to share something we were enthusiastic about with the rest of the world.
And it blossomed from there.
It certainly did.
Could you talk a little bit about the growth in numbers for Love and Rockets from the first issue?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers of the first issue. It started off very low. It started off with maybe a couple thousand at best, and it stayed low for a few of the issues, and then it just started gradually growing. There was an increasingly great response to it, and all the way through the 80s and up to the early 90s, it just kept growing and growing, and it reached, I think the high point of it was somewhere in the high teens.
And do you still sell it regularly today?
We still sell Love and Rockets. After the first series of 50 issues ended, the Hernandez brothers went off and did a couple of solo comics, which never really got the kind of response that Love and Rockets did. The Love and Rockets brand name really was very effective. And so after a few years of that, they came back and relaunched Love and Rockets Volume 2 in a new comics format. And yeah, we're just getting ready, in fact, to send the 15th issue of that one off to the printer. And and we're also starting to prepare the fact that in 2007 we'll have the 25th anniversary of Love and Rockets.
Okay. In terms of back issues, though, are you still printing the entire series?
Not the magazines. At this point, we're not printing back issues of any comics at all. We've gone into the graphic novel model. So all the magazines, all the original comics have been published as graphic novels, which are then reprinted and reprinted.
What's the importance of the graphic novel model?
Well, the importance of the graphic novel model is that it can get into bookstores, whereas comics, the pamphlets, as we've taken to calling them, can't. So in order to continue selling through Amazon.com, through bookstores, and even more and more through comic shops, it's very important to have graphic novels.
And what happened there? Comic books used to be sold in bookstores, right?
No.
No?
Comic books were never sold in bookstores. I mean, they were
On
sold
the
on...
spinner racks and the...
Right, but those weren't bookstores. They were sold in like drugstores.
Okay.
And, where you could buy magazines. They were periodicals. They were never really carried in bookstores now.
Okay.
So that was a virgin territory that we needed to get into, and we certainly have for the last 20 years. That's been the major shift in comics distribution, is conquering the bookstore market.
Okay. When you started out publishing the Comics Journal, you were covering mostly the underground?
No, actually, at the time there wasn't very much underground to cover. So we were, because that was the only thing that really existed, forced to cover the mainstream. So we compensate by covering that with lots of negativity and bitterness.
And then 77, you said?
76,
76.
the Nostalgia Journal was launched, or rather, Gary picked it up from another publisher, turned it into what became the Comics Journal then subsequently.
And Dave Sim started Cerebus in 77?
Right.
Was there... Did you guys and Dave Sim, did you have any kind of did you commiserate at all on the independent publishing world at the beginning?
Not especially, because when he started Cerebus, we weren't comics publishers, and we didn't really connect until a few years into his run, actually. I mean, his Cerebus originally was a very small, almost local Canadian thing, and we weren't aware of it until I think it was past the 10th issue.
Okay, so as the fanzine publishers, you weren't, you were trying to remain outside of the comic books industry.
Well, we weren't intent on being publishers right at first. No,
Okay.
And we were trying to be a magazine about comics, and therefore there was probably at least initially the idea that maybe it wouldn't be such a good idea to actually start publishing comics and become part of the industry we ourselves were trying to monitor and critique. An ideal that clearly fell emphatically by the wayside a few years later.
What do you think generally necessitates an independent publisher? You mentioned that Love and Rockets was something that you thought needed to be seen by a wider audience.
Right. Well, clearly something like Love and Rockets would never in a million years have been published by DC or by Marvel. So the need is right there. Generally speaking, in almost any medium, the breakthrough, the generally exciting work, is never initially published or released or distributed by the big corporations. Later on they come in and take it over, true, but initially at least, all the best work comes from the grassroots of the underground.
Okay. Do you think that creativity is fostered by that independent spirit?
Well, of course. Is creativity is fostered just in the sense that cartoonists aren't told no. I mean, you can sort of, as an academic exercise, try to imagine the first issue of Love and Rockets and what would have had to be changed in it in order for it to be published by Marvel or DC Comics. And you realize that there would have been a large number of restrictions. At that time, the very first thing it was said, well, it's got to be color. Then it was said you need to have the same recurring characters. then they would have at that time again, thrown out the nudity and the violence, and they might have said, well, do they all have to be Mexicans?
Do you think then when the eventuality arises that they that these independent creations are taken over by the mainstream, does the creativity falter at all, or?
I don't think so. Certainly, the experience that I've seen, at least secondhand, with Pantheon, is that they have very much a hands-off policy, and I haven't really heard from any cartoonist who's felt at all restricted by any kind of editorial dictates or anything. Of course, in the case of Pantheon, they're mostly repackaging work, so the work already existed, so they haven't had a chance to mess with it. But so far as I can tell, the editors there are very open, and they just accept what it is that's given to them.
Is that a new attitude within the bigger publishers?
Well, bear in mind that it's different publishers too. I suspect that Marvel and DC have loosened up to some degree. In fact, I know that they've loosened up to some degree. They are allowing cartoonists to run with whatever they want. Certainly Frank Miller can write his own ticket at DC Comics, for instance. So it's much less of a dictatorship than it used to be. But still, they are working within certain parameters.
Was that did the independent comics movement foster that change? Creator rights were pretty much almost unheard of in the mid-'80s, no? For those companies?
For the mainstream, yes. And that changed pretty drastically, obviously. Of course, the difference was, you have to bear in mind that over 90% of the work being done for the mainstream companies consisted in cartoonists working with things they hadn't actually themselves created. So the issue of creators' rights for someone who works on a Superman or Batman story is pretty radically different than the issue of creators' rights for someone who's come up with something like Love and Rockets.
But then that kind of came to a head, not only in the retroactive reimbursement for the Superman and...
Well, the thing to bear in mind is that it was purely commercial, is that the idea that the mainstream companies had all the way up to the 70s is that it didn't really matter who wrote and drew Spider-Man and who wrote and drew Superman. That if someone got a little bit too uppity and asked for health benefits or wanted $2 more a page, you fire his ass and then you hire the next guy in line. Then of course what started happening in the 70s is that certain cartoonists became superstars, and as the market shifted toward the fan market as opposed to the general market, these superstars were able to command a loyal following, and it was no longer a matter, if John Byrne, who was doing X-Men, if he got in a disagreement and got kicked out and replaced with someone else, sales might very well fall. And again, in that case, if John Byrne had a disagreement with Marvel, then DC was there and wanted to give him incentive to come to DC because there was actually legitimately money to be made. So we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that this was in any way altruistic. It was just a fact that the market changed and individual cartoonists became a valuable commodity instead of just being replaceable cogs in the machine.
So I wasn't aware that happened actually all the way in the 70s. I thought it kind of boiled over in the 80s.
It boiled over. It started fermenting in the 70s, and then it did boil over in the 80s. There was talk about it, the creators' rights and what can be done. But yeah, the 80s definitely is when it all really happened.
Okay. What is the role of a publisher or editor in the creative development of a property?
I think the role of a publisher is just to take the vision of the cartoonist and present it in the very best way possible, just to support him. We're probably the least hands-on in terms of editorial input or publisher input. We essentially feel that the cartoonists at the level of which we're dealing with know what they're doing, and they don't really need a whole lot of editorial tampering with. Others may disagree.
But you found that works for you.
Yeah. Well, I think the evidence is there. I mean, you'll note that in the case of books that we published that then Pantheon repackaged, I mean, we did no editorial interference whatsoever on those, and Pantheon, once they repackaged them, didn't seem the need to change anything either. So it worked. I mean, there's some cartoonists who like to get editorial feedback and will send us the work in progress and say, what do you think of this? But most of them really just prefer to sit down and go ahead and do it.
When you were starting out with the fanzine, and then also when it became the Comics Journal, and then when you initially published the first Love and Rockets, what tools did you use to promote your work? How important were things like conventions or mail order advertisements? If you can remember.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. Obviously, we did advertising. We did attend conventions. The cartoonists especially would attend conventions and do signings. We didn't have a lot of money to throw around, so it was all very low-key. Essentially, we were dependent on the comic shops being aware of the material and stocking it and selling it.
Okay. But, like, the Comics Journal now is a main way for independent publishers to make themselves be seen.
Right.
How did the Comics Journal do that when the Comics Journal wasn't around? Were there other magazines or outlets for that?
Well, before the Comics Journal was around, I mean, fanzines were really fanzines, and that was just mail order. You know, it's just this whole little network of comics fans who knew each other. Then, of course, there were the undergrounds, who were a completely different phenomenon, who were distributed on, you know, in head shops and through that kind of newsstands.
So mostly hand to hand.
Yeah. No, we weren't like, you know, taking out TV ads or ads in the New York Times or anything.
And there wasn't a distributor handling you.
Well, yeah, there were distributors. There were a couple of distributors who specialized in the comics, and who were distributing both the mainstream comics and the whole alternative underground fanzine level of things.
How has that changed through the years?
It hasn't changed that much, except it's all become consolidated into one distributor. They fought it out for 25 years or 25 years, and essentially one of them came out on top.
And has that affected smaller publishers, self-publishers, smaller independent comics with smaller print runs?
I don't know that it has that much. I mean, there's always the danger of monopoly, of course, which is what essentially the distribution situation is right now. There are 2 or 3 smaller distributors as well, but there is one distributor who controls something like 75 to 80% of distribution. And you essentially have to go through this distributor, and if that distributor decides not to carry something, then you're pretty well shut out. But they have, as far as I can tell, used that power, you know, relatively wisely and gently. You know, I'm sure there are obviously there are horror stories and difficulties here and there, but on balance, I think they've done pretty well by everyone.
Okay.
Although, of course, we speak from a relative position of power, so someone who is much smaller might have a different story. But they've always done well by us.
So, for your definition of independent comics, I think you said it was followed an artist's unique vision.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't apply the business models to that? Anyway, I mean, how do independent comics differentiate from Marvel or DC? Like DC doing Dark Knight, which is
Right.
an individual's unique vision.
But it's an individual, unique vision of a character who was created in 1939
Okay.
and was owned by the corporation. And, you know, that has a certain set of restrictions applied to it.
So is that differentiated then from, say, High Waters, what was it, Goober Skeeber?
Well, that's kind of a joke, right? The Marvel one. Well, I mean the alternative, the independent cartoonists, you know, do have a certain fascination with the mainstream. You can certainly see, if you look closely at Love and Rockets, that there's a lot of, you know, Steve Ditko, the guy who co-created Spider-Man in there, for instance. So there's definitely a dialogue going on, in the same way that independent filmmakers do draw things from the more mainstream filmmakers.
Okay.
It's really not two entirely separate houses. They feed back and forth into each other.
Well, that went pretty quickly, unless you wouldn't mind. I know that you're fairly well versed in the history of comics.
Mm-hmm.
If you could give a quick rundown of the where you see it starting from and how it progressed a little bit.
I don't know. The history of American comics is, at least for the first half century, was pretty depressing. There's just sort of a downward death spiral for most of it, with little sparks of light. As far as I'm concerned, it really only started turning around again in the 70s, 60s and 70s with the underground. Has gone back up since then. Most comics were historically crap for a long, long time, and that's a legacy that we have to live with and have to contend with every day. I mean, there's a reason that even now, 15 to 20 years after Mao's, most articles about adult comics have to start off with, you know, well, comics really aren't for kids anymore. And that's because comics were for kids for many years. And they were not only for kids, they were like bad comics for kids.
Do you think, how is that, other than stating comics aren't for kids anymore, which is kind of a silly saying, how can that be overcome? How can that stigma be overcome?
I mean, it's a silly saying, but on the other hand, if you take grabs the average man and woman in the street and suggest to them there's such a thing as graphic novels, you know, which present, you know, literary, adult, you know, serious journalistic themes, they'll be astonished. I mean, it really is true. The graphic novel hasn't penetrated the general populace as an idea yet.
Do you think that astonishment leads to interest?
I don't know. People are so bombarded with media these days that it's hard to keep track of everything. I think it takes a lot to really penetrate someone's consciousness as you know, hey, I kind of would like to check that out. You know, because they're awfully busy with you know, the media they're aware of.
But at the same time, they complain about the media they're aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Flipping through channels without finding anything.
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood out of ideas.
Right.
Meanwhile, we have this wealth of creativity within comic books.
Yeah, although I think the majority of people are perfectly happy with entertainment the way it is.
Really?
I think so.
Okay.
Otherwise, they pay a lot of money for it, you know.
But again, do you think that might not be because they're not aware that something better might exist?
I don't know. You know, an Adam Sandler movie comes out the same weekend as you know, a Todd Haynes movie, and people are aware of it. You know, if they read Time or Newsweek or Entertainment Weekly, I mean, they know that they have these two choices, and you know which one they're going to choose.
Yeah.
It's. I think they're aware at least of the existence of these things, and they go for the comfort food. They go for. I mean, the reason that. I mean, McDonald's isn't successful because it's not that McDonald's is successful because people don't like the taste of the burgers. I mean, they love the taste of the burgers. Let's face it. And the reason the big bad Hollywood blockbusters are successful is because the people who go to see them enjoy them, and they want to go and see the next one. I mean, you may catch a few people blowing off steam saying, "Boy, that was really bad. I don't want to see another one," but they'll be back the following week.
But if given the choice, if they knew that, say, something like Johnny Ryan existed, don't you think they would enjoy that more?
No.
I'm saying, like, no.
Possibly.
Or Hate. Maybe
Yeah,
Hate's a more fair example, because Johnny Ryan.
And Hate was successful. I mean, Hate did really well. Hate was selling better at its heyday than a lot of the superhero comics at the time. It's possible. I mean, it requires a whole mindset almost to start reading comics with the idea that they are, adult or serious, or at least something that grown-ups can read. I mean, it's a whole paradigm shift that people have trouble adapting to, I think.
So then, in making that shift, if you were to talk to somebody about what would you tell them makes comic books interesting or fun?
Well, it's goofy pictures. It's fun. It's a unique medium. There are things that comics do that no other medium can do. There's just all these fascinating things that happen between the panels. There's a way that you read images, both for the visual information and for the narrative information. It's just, I think anyone who, reads comics becomes more and more fascinated with and involved with them. It's hard to define. I mean, it's like, what makes movies special? What makes opera special?
Okay, fair enough. A couple of people have said that the comic industry seems to be back on an upswing. What do you see as the current state of the comic book industry?
I think the comic industry goes up and goes down and stays more or less at the same level. I guess it depends on if you define the comics industry as specifically the comics publishers or anyone who publishes comics. It's I don't know, upswing, downswing. So far as I know, the actual numbers haven't changed a whole lot either way in the last few years.
That's numbers in dollars, not readers, though.
Right. Although dollars and readers is gonna, they're gonna correlate pretty narrowly.
But the cost of comic books is almost quadrupled in 20 years.
Yeah. Oh, they have been relatively stable for the last, probably for the last decade. It hasn't. The big explosion was when it went from. As I recall, in the 1970s, they were like at 12 or 15 cents, and then by the within 10-15 years, they had gone to 10-15 times that. That was the big. So of late, that has slacked off to a certain degree. So if the dollar amount is remaining stable, then sales and readers really are remaining stable.
Okay.
There's certainly there are exceptions. There like something like Mouse comes along, and obviously that is a huge success. But the degree to which the big successes like Mouse and Jimmy Corrigan are actually pulling along all the other cartoonists, that's still open to question. The degree to which the rising tide floats all boats, we don't know yet. Mouse is definitely a unique phenomenon. It was. I think what was interesting about Mouse is it really didn't pull anything else along with it at all. Mouse benefited Mouse, and that was it.
So there wasn't any. There was very little, if any, bleed over when people went and purchased Mouse because of the.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think is because there was very little out at that time that was as good as a graphic novel as Mouse. In fact, there was almost nothing.
Wasn't Palestine out at the same time?
No. Palestine was as a graphic novel came out several years later.
Okay.
So if you bought and enjoyed Mouse, and then you went to the bookstore and said, "I really enjoyed this. What else do you have like this?" the answer was nothing. And that was a problem. There was no follow-up to be had. These days, of course, that's no longer true. If you pick up a Jimmy Corrigan and enjoy it, or Palestine and enjoy it, and walk into a bookshop or a comic shop and say, what else do you have like this? They can just turn around and say, well, here's a whole shelf of things that are more or less like this.
Okay. I think I'm ready for the last question. It's a little fruity, but if you could be as earnest as possible, and just apply as much thought as you're willing to it. Where do ideas come from?
Where do ideas come from? Well, I wouldn't know because I've never really had an idea myself. I've just exploited other people's ideas.
Okay.
Really, I think it's a question you have to ask the people who actually come up with the ideas. I think some of them just wake up in the morning with 20 ideas, and others sit and, I think in the words of Douglas Adams, stare at a blank sheet of paper until blood comes out their forehead.
Have you never found yourself considering it though?
No.
No?
I just don't have that creative gene, I guess. I don't have any stories to tell.
It just seems like buried in this wealth of creativity at Fantagraphics that.
On the other hand, look who I'm up against. You know, after I published the Hernandez brothers and Robert Crumb and Dan Clowes and Chris Ware, I think it would be sort of a monumental act of arrogance to say, well, I'm going to publish myself as well. That and I can't draw.
But have you ever thought, where do these guys get their ideas? Or
I've thought about it, and I don't think anybody knows. I mean, you get ideas from stories you hear. I know that a lot of the things that Gilbert Hernandez wrote about, at least in the early Palomar installments, were stories that his relatives had told him, for instance. And clearly a lot of Jaime's work is based on things that he saw and heard and was told about from the 80s Los Angeles punk movement. People who do autobiography or journalism, it's kind of obvious where their ideas come from. You don't need to ask Joe Sacco where his ideas come from. Others just deal with their own emotional tribulations and try to work them out on paper. I mean, I think that very clearly that's the case with something like Jimmy Corrigan, for instance.
Okay. Good.
Best I can do on that one.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I think we covered everything.
Okay.